Ukraine is calling for heavier weaponry to help it in its fight against Russia. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has urged the West to bring Russia to justice. NATO foreign ministers have been discussing how to provide more support to the war-torn country. Ukrainian defense officials have warned that Moscow's long-term objective is to take over the entire country. Meanwhile, residents in the east have been urged to quickly evacuate as more parts come under heavy Russian fire.
A trail of destruction in Ukraine's capital after Russia pulled out of areas near Kyiv. Ukrainian soldiers have been picking up pieces of ammunition and spare parts from tanks left behind by enemy troops. Moscow has shifted its target to the east. Artillery and airstrikes have pummeled the Donbas region. Ukraine is stepping up calls on NATO to help the country in its fight against Russia.
My agenda is very simple. It has only 3 items on it. It's weapons, weapons, and weapons. And I call on all allies to put aside their hesitations, their reluctance, to provide Ukraine with everything it needs. Because as weird as it may sound, but today weapons serve the purpose of peace.
Western nations have unveiled a fresh wave of sanctions on Russia as evidence of more atrocities emerged.
Цей пакет виглядає ефектно, але цього замало. Але все ж навряд чи його можна назвати співмірним тому злу, яке світ побачив в Бучі, тому злу, яке продовжується в Маріуполі, в обстрілах Харкова, в намаганні Росії розпочати новий, глобальний, кривавий наступ на Донбасі.
Relentless shelling has been reported in the easternmost city of Severodonetsk. Hundreds have been forced to seek refuge underground. Thousands of people are desperately trying to escape Donbas ahead of a major offensive in the east. Residents have been warned that Russian forces are trying to cut off all escape routes, and so the next few days may be their only chance to flee. The war has so far forced more than 4 million to flee Ukraine. Thousands have been killed or wounded. A quarter of the population is now homeless, with cities turned into rubble. Ukraine's military claims Russian soldiers are facing a manpower shortage. It also believes their morale is low and could deteriorate as the war drags on. Meanwhile, there are reports about 75 Russian soldiers said to be receiving medical treatment after being exposed to radiation at Chernobyl. Moscow had attempted to gain control of the nuclear power plant, but it failed after Ukrainian forces blew up a key access route.
And Philip Crowther joins us live from Lviv. Philip, Kyiv says the fiercest battles are now in Luhansk. Civilians being urged to flee while they still can. Now, we've heard this warning for a few days now. Is there still time to leave safely?
It looks like that time is almost up, to be honest. We're seeing reports now of there being serious difficulties for people in towns in the Luhansk and the Donetsk regions to actually still get out. There had been that call from local governors of both of those regions for people to evacuate as quickly as possible with their own means, meaning in their private cars or maybe even in trains that are still available right now before those gates essentially close. And the comparison, of course, is being made to what is happening in Mariupol in the southeast of the country and what has been happening there for weeks. It's a besieged city, and it's almost impossible for civilians to get out of there right now. Around 160,000 are still there, according to British intelligence, and there have been very few evacuation corridors out of there that have actually worked out. Again, for today, several evacuation corridors have been planned, have been agreed upon between Ukrainian and Russian forces, and those include some ways out of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and even some evacuation trains out of the Donetsk region that have been announced by the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk. Now, all of this is because there is that certainty, and we're already seeing the proof on the ground that Russia is and will be increasing its attacks in the east, especially right now on the so-called line of control. That is the border, essentially, between Ukrainian-controlled areas in that Donbas region and those controlled right now by pro-Russian separatists.
Now, this concentration of Russia on the east of Ukraine, if Moscow was able to carve that out, would that be sufficient for Mr. Putin to then say he has achieved what he wanted and the offensive can stop now?
It's very difficult to say right now because remember that the goals from Russian President Vladimir Putin for Ukraine have changed so many times during this invasion of Ukraine already. At the start, it was supposed to be a slight incursion in the east to protect the so-called independent republics there in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Then, of course, as you've heard, there's been so much talk from the Russian side of denazification. Of course, that is impossible. It is an invention from Russia. But it does indicate that Russia might want complete control over Ukraine. How does it get it? Well, possibly by controlling the east of the country and then moving again toward the capital city, Kiev. We simply don't know what the end goal here is for Russia and what would make it possible for Vladimir Putin to actually declare victory. He was unable to declare victory the way he possibly wanted to, which would have been by essentially getting control of the capital city, Kiev, within the first few days of this invasion. That appears to have been the goal, and Russia completely failed at that attempt.
Oh, thanks for that. Philip Crowther reporting for us there from Lviv.
NATO foreign ministers have been holding talks on how best to support Ukraine. The alliance has so far refused to send troops and to impose a no-fly zone over the war-stricken country. Rosie Burchard joins us live now from Brussels for more. Rosie, providing Ukraine with more weapons, that seems to be top of the agenda for NATO foreign ministers at the moment.
I'm here at the Alliance headquarters in Brussels. And Dawn, I was there as Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba arrived to the talks this morning, and he truly made his wish list crystal clear: weapons, weapons, weapons. He also made a reference to the difference between offensive and defensive weapons, speaking to a reticence among, some NATO allies to provide Ukraine with offensive weapons for fear of that being seen as a bid to escalate this conflict. Now, NATO allies have been providing Ukraine with weapons, and we do expect them to pledge to keep providing Ukraine with military aid. However, militarily, that really is as far as they are willing to go. They have reiterated that there will be no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg really once again spelled that out.
NATO provides support to Ukraine, but NATO is not sending troops to be on the ground. And we also have a responsibility to prevent this conflict from escalating beyond Ukraine and become even more deadly, even more dangerous and destructive. So we are providing support, but at the same time working hard to prevent escalation of the conflict.
Well, Stoltenberg also had a very sobering message as he opened those talks. He said that this conflict could rage on for months, if not years.
Well, there's some sense of collective responsibility among NATO members, Rosie, but some of them also fear that they might be Russia's next target if they help Ukraine.
Well, especially those NATO allies that are along what's known as the alliance's eastern flank, that either share a border with Ukraine or share a border with Russia or Belarus, that are feeling very exposed at this moment. But as members of NATO, they are party to the alliance's collective defence agreement known as Article 5, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all. That means they can count on help from other NATO allies in case of a breach of their sovereignty or an attempted breach. However, Ukraine is not a member of the alliance, and that's so much at the core and has been at the core of this conflict all along, when that was one of Russia's key demands, that NATO effectively bar Ukraine from ever joining, something NATO said it would never do, that its open door policy would remain intact.
Rosie, thank you very much for that. Rosie Burchard there in Brussels.